This review and analysis of Star Trek Picard Episode 6, The Impossible Box, contains full spoilers. The link to the playlist with the reviews of the other episodes is also in the description. Just before putting this episode on, I was slightly spoiled by Amazon Prime's thumbnail for it, which featured Soji and Picard in the same screen cap. There was some comfort in this though. After last week's episode actually being sort of interesting, there was a fear that the show might return to its prior dithering, as Raffi has to return to Earth to water her Venus flytrap, while Picard teaches Elnor about the terroir of his grapes. Instead, no, Picard finally got the couple of lines he needed to hear from the promptly latent Bruce Maddox, and they're warping right off to the artifact. The pre-titles teaser flashback element was Soji having a dream briefly of when she was a little girl, walking into a room with plants and a man. It's exactly as interesting as it sounds, but the soundtrack is an overdrive trying to convince us that this is creepy. The extent to which she's an android versus being flesh and blood hasn't exactly been spelled out, but I would have thought she's not so organic that she could ever have been a small girl, meaning my immediate guess was this was probably some composite returning memory of being built in a lab. She wakes up in bed with Narek. It shouldn't be surprising, they seem to spend more time in bed than John and Yoko, but I didn't think he was sleeping over. The teaser reminds us that, like her sister, Soji could activate in the same way, and when that happened with Daj, she easily fought off and or killed multiple armed and armoured Zhat Vash attackers. Narek would seem to be throwing caution to the wind then. Who's to say what level of danger might trigger her activation? It could be that all he has to do is knock a lamp over, walk into the bathroom in the early hours, and that'll be the end of him. You know what, actually, let him stay over. They have more of these same circular conversations that makes me realise how lucky we were to get a week away from them last time, and glad that this stuff is coming to an end. Romulans have an extra secret name as well, supposedly, because they've thrust so many other silly things on this once interesting and mysterious people that what's one more. Over with our main crew, they're having a conversation for the audience's benefit, which includes Dr. Jurati mentioning that Picard's assimilation by the Borg included nanoprobes. Now, nanoprobes were a later innovation on Voyager in storytelling terms, but considering how fast acting they seem to be in comparison with the slow process we see Picard go through in the Best of Both Worlds, I didn't think his assimilation involved them, which also would explain how he was so much more easily de-Borgified at the end. Either way, we see that the thought of the Borg still stresses Picard out. Indeed, the older he's got, the worse they bother him. When he encountered them in later episodes of The Next Generation, he wasn't so impacted emotionally. A few years later in First Contact, and he's retconned into being much more haunted about it, and now it only takes a mention of them to set him off. Post-titles, Rios is kicking a football around the ship at night when Jurati comes out, and then they have it off. Back in my Star Trek, it would take literal years for characters to become involved romantically. Now it's probably the only thing that happens quickly in this show. Narek and Narek's sister have a drawn-out conversation about his attempts to get information from Soji while they play with a puzzle toy that opens up when you solve it. It's a visual metaphor for Soji, you see. She's the real titular impossible box. For the bottom percentile of the audience for whom this very clever analogy wasn't obvious when it was first shown, they also discuss it at great length. They also hypothesise Soji's dream is her subconscious trying to tell her she's a robot or something. The dream is something we haven't seen before, but Narek says it's recurring, so it's handy he found out about it now. Whether it's recurring or not doesn't really make a difference to us, as they've missed an opportunity to foreshadow it in all the previous episodes of not much else happening on the artifact. But I suppose a dream popping into Soji's head only just as Narek needs a lead before his sister takes over would have been too coincidental, rather than the lower level coincidence of him just happening to find out about it at this point. After this, the crew's plan to get onto the artifact is explained. Nothing too fancy or, well, interesting. Picard is going to get status as a Federation envoy so he can meet the head of the Borg reclamation project there, who is of course Hugh. Rafi attains this from a Starfleet friend who happened to be at her desk at the time because she answered immediately, and is another black lady. They don't go into full sass speak, but there's a bit of calling each other babe and what have you. The dialogue to convince us these two people are pals is pretty lame. At best it's like overhearing two people you don't know talking on a bus, and about as engaging. The biggest issue with it though is beyond the pleasantries, it's them reiterating the plot which we the audience are already aware of, which is what we've just had a bit of from Narek and friends already as well. After this we get Rafi telling Rios about her son, which we saw all of last week anyway. It's as though it's making up for last week's well-paced and enjoyable episode by making doubly sure to explain to us everything that's happening in the manner of episodes 2 through 4. Soji has one of her Skype calls to her computer mother, during which she's hypnotised to sleep at her desk and later comes to, complete with overdone Mickey Mousing sound effects of the lights coming on. Her grain of doubt about whether her mother's actually real leads her to scan all of her possessions, and the computer dates them all as around 37 months old. She freaks out and tells Narek, who suggests they try a Romulan memory dream ritual thing that involves walking around a room that has lamps on the floor. I know the Romulans were probably the most mysterious major race of old Trek, but they weren't such a tabula rasa that you can make up any old thing and add it onto their culture. They were pragmatic and materialist, and generally seemed to be a culture built in reaction against the spiritual and sanctimonious Vulcans they had left centuries earlier. In this show they're given vague myths and rituals and nuns and whatever else the writers fancy. Cultures change of course, and you could point to the differences between the original series Klingons and Klingons as portrayed after that as a prime example, but the Romulans have been reasonably consistent from the start in not having any of this kind of thing in there. Perhaps the Shinzon coup followed by the destruction of Romulus forced a huge cultural shift in the space of 2 decades, but it's a real stretch to say the least. Picard gets jittery about beaming aboard the artifact, which he only has license to do alone. It's not helped that he's beamed to a dark section of it where no one's around, so he freaks out and nearly falls off the edge of a platform until Hugh finds him. This cube must have been built after Voyager gave the Borg a hammering in Endgame, because it seems they were so hard up for resources that they had to economise on handrails. This moment is appreciated though for adding some ominosity back to the Borg ship. I'd complained previously that seeing so much of this 90s laser quest of a cube had demystified the whole thing, so seeing Picard freak out over it helped get the old feeling back. Picard reuniting with Hugh was a great moment as well, as was him seeing what the reclamation project does in restoring former Borg drones and the effect it has on Picard emotionally. After that, they try to track down Soji. Meanwhile, Soji walks around her dream kind of lucidly in this ritual. It's well put together enough, but again it could have been so much better had they foreshadowed it before this episode. It wouldn't have been hard to find a few places to add some snippets. Maybe you could call it a callback to the Next Generation episode Birthright Part 1, where Data's ability to dream is, rather than developed over time as his creator had hoped, instead jump-started suddenly when he receives a shock from an energy discharge. It's not a callback though, it's just that they didn't think to include bits of Soji's dream before now. She sees enough to locate where she was built for Narek's purposes, at which point he locks her in the room and tries to gas her. What's more, the gas comes from his puzzle cube. I'm guessing he didn't do that when he had it as a small boy, or maybe toys that kill your children if they don't solve them fast enough are another addition to the ever-expansive Romulan culture now. Rather than gas though, which is what it obviously looks like, Narek refers to it as radiation. The device and the release were a little bit like the Thaleron device that killed the Senate in Star Trek Nemesis really, which of course was a type of radiation. So too could Soji hammering on the glass as Narek looks sad about the whole situation as radiation starts to flood the room be a loose reference to Spock's death in the Wrath of Khan, but then Star Trek's done so many things at this stage that it's possible to see callbacks in just about anything. Soji activates though and punches through the floor to escape. Despite the immense size of the Borg ship, she happens to be so near to where Hugh and Picard are when her signal comes back that they get to her before Narek. The three of them then escape to the Queen's chamber, where she had some handy escape technology that can beam 40,000 light years in any direction, which only Hugh knows is there. Incidentally, it was Soji who jumped in and knew it was 40,000 light years. What could this mean? Now, this piece of technology could be interesting from a continuity perspective. In First Contact, Picard notes the impossibility of the Borg Queen there being the same one he was retconned in that film as having met in the best of both worlds, that cube and all the Borg on it having been destroyed. This particularly nifty escape route transporter would solve that question, and yet Hugh says it was technology that hadn't yet been assimilated when Picard was Locutus, so it can't have been the answer. It's a creation that would both seem to solve the needs of this story and solve an old question, and yet for unclear reasons a line is put in specifically stopping that from being the case. Maybe it's so we don't wonder why Picard never knew of it, though we wouldn't expect him to have so much knowledge of the Borg when he was only in the collective for a relatively short period of time, and specifically for the purpose of being a figurehead for the assimilation of Earth. Seven of Nine had a great deal of Borg knowledge, but she was assimilated as a child and integrated into them for many years. Of course, even if we invoke this to solve the Borg Queen question between Best of Both Worlds and First Contact, it still doesn't explain how seemingly the same Queen is also the one in the Voyager finale. My personal headcanon is that any Queen has the requisite knowledge and ability to take over the Borg and also has the personality to match, and if one dies another can be brought online to take her place, and perhaps a particular few versions are cloned for ease of transferability, also explaining why some are seemingly the same. Of course, nerds have been arguing over the Borg Queen for 24 years now, so we can't expect to solve this one here. Elnor, despite orders from Picard to stay put, beams over to help them fight off the approaching Romulans who are chasing down Soji, creating more issues than it solves, not least that he managed to disappear to the back of the ship and beam himself away without Rios and Jurati noticing, even though it's pretty open plan in there. If he's able to beam right to Picard's location, why can't Picard, Soji and Hugh just beam up to the ship rather than taking this special Borg Queen transporter and telling Rios where to meet them? The only line that I think might approach an explanation is Rios saying the Romulans have restricted Picard to one beam-in location, though if that's a matter of protocol then all bets ought to be off now they're being chased by Romulans with guns, and if it's a matter of technological jamming or something, then how did Elnor manage to show up at the right place out of nowhere? Did the Romulans leave the beam-in location accessible even after Picard arrived, and then Elnor beamed to the same place and they managed to find exactly where Picard was after all his wanderings? There's a lot of dithering as well when Elnor insists on staying behind to protect Picard while he escapes, and Hugh is staying behind to prevent the Romulans tracing where they've transported to. So syllogistically Elnor is there to hold off the Romulans getting to Hugh until he's closed the room off. Considering though that Hugh is head of the Reclamation Project and a Federation citizen, presumably he could walk off whistling pretending he doesn't know what's been going on, and even point the approaching Romulans in the wrong direction, telling them they went that way, and might be senior enough to get away with that. On the other hand, having Elnor with him cutting heads off anyone who comes near would seem to ruin his chances of surviving this at all. The logic is stretched here, and it seems Elnor's been inserted just to give us some emotional impact and excitement at the ending, rather than the perhaps anticlimactic conclusion of Picard and Soji just beaming away. I mentioned in my episode 4 review that for Elnor to actually use his sword skills versus guns is going to be stupid or else highly contrived, and they work around this by having the doors closed behind him, so we only hear the start of that confrontation and don't see anything. The implication would seem to be that that's curtains for him, even though he'd only have appeared in 3 episodes before dying not very necessarily, or else he'll just beam back to the regular ship, again raising the question of why Picard, Soji and possibly also Hugh didn't just do that. As I say, Hugh's in for a devil of a time explaining himself being left with a guy cutting up every Romulan in sight. The amount of effort in introducing Elnor means I find it very unlikely he'll be killed off here. I expect he'll show up to help in the nick of time somewhere down the line, like Shran in the Enterprise episode 0 Hour. Same for 7 of 9, though that's more of a hope. The convoluted nature of the ending is a bit disappointing because things were pretty interesting for the last third or so of the episode. The first 2/3 are actually even worse than the standard of the filler in episodes 2 and 3, with characters having conversations that repeated things, some of which had already been explained to us in this same episode. But once Soji started exploring her dream while Picard met Hugh, things were good. Picard's getting freaked out over the Borg was good too, showing that the horror of them has actually come to haunt him more over time, despite the seeming catharsis of the denouement of First Contact. At least we've finally reached the show's paradigm shift. No more of Narek and Soji's tedious encounters. She's with Picard now and off the artifact. Like Soji's dream, another thing was introduced in this episode that's immediately become a major concept. Narek's sister saying to find out where the planet of the synths is, which is what the end result of exploring the dream was. Previously it was about establishing whether there were any more like Soji at all, not knowing there was a planet waiting to be found. This episode was a real step down in quality from last week's, and much more akin to the ones preceding that. It seems this show only really works when there is a self-contained story in there alongside the overarching plot development. Remembrance was the establishment of Picard now, the current Trek universe, and the story of Dahj, and Stardust City Rag was the story of 7 of 9 now. Though that episode is likely destined to be remembered mainly as the one where Icheb got his eye cut out, it's head and shoulders above the rest of the show thanks to 7, and her absence again this week was really felt. If the show only really thrives on the presence of classic characters though, at least next week is the one with Riker and Troy. Thank you for listening. Do please like and share if you've enjoyed it, and leave me a comment with your thoughts. If you feel I deserve it, I would be very grateful if you'd subscribe. It means you'll be notified as soon as I review next week's episode, the one with Riker and Troy. The links to the social media are in the description below, including to the Discord server if you fancy popping by for a chat there. This is Jonathan from Headhunters Media, and I hope I'll catch you again soon.